A Guten Erev Shabbos. This Shabbos is a very special Shabbos. We have the portion of Tetzaveh, which is unique in its own way. We have Zachor, one of the 4 parshios of early spring, and it's the Shabbos before Purim. So much more here than meets the eye. So much depth to explore and take inspiration from. The first item on our agenda, not necessarily in order of importance, but just because it's the first thing we notice when we open the book this week, is that something very important is missing from our weekly Sedra. Moshe is missing. Now, we say, V'zot HaTorah asher sam Moshe. We sing it when we lift the Torah. This is the Torah that Moses set before the children of Israel. So, we would expect to find a mention of him somewhere in each parsha. And God spoke to Moses saying, Moshe instructed the Jewish people somewhere. This week, nowhere. Moshe's name is not in the parsha, not anywhere to be found. The Gemara explains that this is, in a sense, Moshe's own doing. Next week, we're going to learn about a very embarrassing, as my kids would say, cringe event, the golden calf, idolatry. Not to go into depth now, but it was one of our worst errors in judgment as a people. In asking for forgiveness from God on behalf of the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, pulled out all the stops. Im ayin, he says, Mecheni na mesifrecha. He says to God, if you can't forgive the Jewish people for this sin, then remove my name from your book. Take me out of the Chumash. I don't want to be associated with the book that doesn't have space for forgiveness in it, even for this worst of sins. Gemara says that everything a tzaddik says comes to pass in some form or another. So here you have it. Of course, Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not erased from the entire Torah, but in one parsha it is, and Tetzaveh is it. This week's portion is what the Torah would look like if Moshe were edited out, God forbid. And yet, interestingly, please note that Tetzaveh is not the first word in our portion. Usually the first word gives its name to the portion. It's the second word. What's the first word? Ve'ata, and you. Ve'ata tetzaveh means you should command, or you should connect the Bnei Yisrael. God is speaking to Moshe still. It's one thing to say that his name is erased. That doesn't mean that he himself is gone. In fact, in a sense, he's closer. When you're sitting talking to your friend over coffee, do you keep saying their name over and over again? Well, Frank, it's like this. Listen, Frank, remember when you said to me last week? Isn't that right, Frank? Normally you don't do that. It gets annoying real fast. Normally you say you. You. That's not a person's name. It's a pronoun, but it shows more closeness, more intimacy than using a name. A married couple, a parent and child. Someone again made the joke this week that they only heard their actual name when their parents were angry at them. That's when you get the full name. But usually we say you, or we don't say anything at all. You look at the person, make eye contact, and speak to them. That's how you know you're talking to each other. So Moshe Rabbeinu's name, missing from the Sedra, can be a negative thing, if you choose to view it in that light, or it could be a positive thing, a relationship on a deeper and more personal level beyond names, where God simply calls him you. Think about that idea of different levels of closeness and intimacy when we read about another item in this week's parsha, the daily offering. Since we're learning about the construction of the Mishkan, a portable shul in the midst of the Israelite camp where God chooses to dwell, as we talked about last week, build me a sanctuary and I will dwell amongst them, Vasuli Mikdash, V'shachanti B'socham, says God. We have to learn the particulars of how it functions. What do you do with it once you build it? Last week was the materials and the method to build this portable sanctuary. This week is the clothing of the priests, the Kohanim, some of the offerings. In weeks to come, we'll learn about the Shabbat extra offering, called a Musaf, the Yom Tov extra offering, also called a Musaf. We'll learn about sin offerings and guilt offerings, thanksgiving offerings, appropriately called Korban Todah, offerings of thanks. Eventually, we'll get to talk about Bikurim, bringing first fruits of the harvest. We'll read in Parshas Achremos about the offerings of Kippurim, of Kapara, atonement offerings to be brought on the 10th of Tishrei, Yom HaKippurim. Let's call these special event offerings. But in this week's Parsha, we learn about the Korban Tamid, the daily offering. If you missed it, don't worry, we're going to see it again in Parshas Pinchas at the end of Bamidbar. Our sages explain that we see it twice, once to teach us about in the Mishkan times, a second time to suggest that it's an eternal mitzvah, no matter where and when we live, to give thanks daily for life and all the wonderful things that we have. Again, the question here is, what do we do when the thing we want is missing? So one answer might be, our answer might be, let's draw closer. Look at how things were in the times of the Mishkan, times of the wilderness before we came into Israel for the first little while after we entered into the land of Israel with Joshua. For over 400 years. Look at how things were in the temple. 400 years for the first temple, 400 years for the second. We're talking about over a millennium altogether. The Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, were really spectators with what was going on there. The Kohanim, the priests, did the work in the temple. It was called avodah. It was called service. And while there was heavy lifting and physical exertion involved, it doesn't really bother that much. It doesn't bother you that much if you love what you do. And if you love the one whom you're doing it for. Yeah? So the Levites sang and played instruments. Must have been quite a beautiful and moving service, avodah, and I hope we'll see it again soon in all its glory. But the rest of us who were not blessed to be Kohanim or Levi'im, we were spectators. We were watching from the sidelines. We weren't even allowed in the more sacred precincts, the place where the offerings were done. We could see from the bleachers, but the inner sanctums where the menorah was lit, the incense was offered, where the ark rested, we couldn't even go in there. And behind the curtain where the ark actually stood, you know that part, only the high priest, and only on Yom Kippur once a year. So all this that we're talking about vanished in the year 70, now 1953 years ago. So what was to be done? All our glory, all our service, all our mode of connecting with God, not just on Shabbos, not just on Shavuos, but every day, our korban tamid, our korban todah, our expression of thanksgiving and appreciation for life and all that we have in it, gone. What were we supposed to do? Here's what we did. We drew closer. We drew closer. You might say we democratized the whole thing. We did not give up hope. We did not abandon our connection with God. We did not even despair that it wouldn't be like it was. Okay, we probably did despair a little bit. We have Tisha B'Av to recall that day. For a long time there was a decree against using musicians at weddings. How could we truly rejoice when Jerusalem, the eternal and undivided capital of Israel, was in ruins and we were in exile? Even today, you'll notice, we break a glass at the chuppah as a sign of sadness. People leave a little bit of their homes unfinished, a wall unplastered or unpainted, to show that our life is incomplete. It cannot be complete when Jerusalem is not completely rebuilt. And yet, we do rejoice. We do dance at weddings. We sing at Brisson. We eat on Shabbos and Yom Tov, sometimes during the week too. And we do give thanks daily, each one of us, from the very first words we say in the day, the first words out of our mouth in the morning, Moda ani lefanecha. Thanks from me to you, God, for returning my soul to me for another day. We wrote a Siddur, thanks to the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, men of the Great Assembly, that scripts for us each day how to express our thanks and appreciating and connecting to God verbally, how to do all that. We have to say the words, and all the better if we do it with a community, with a minyan, but it's completely up to us to mean them, to let what we're saying affect our hearts and our minds, and change the way we see the world around us and how we interact with it. Each of us now is involved in the daily service, the avodah. Each of us can offer our own prayers, our own musafin, our own kaparot, our own todah, thanksgiving offering. We do it through prayer, which we call avodah shebelev, the service of the heart. In the absence of a mishkan, a portable sanctuary or a temple, we found a way to get closer. We took the crisis of a destroyed temple and an exiled people, and we drew closer. Closer to God, closer to each other. That is what we do. We are going to take out a second Sefer Torah this Shabbos, the second of 4 special weeks when we do this, leading up to Pesach. We will read Parshas Zachor. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way, and don't forget. If you like, take a look in your Siddur, the Art Scroll Siddur, on page 176, in the middle of the page. 177 in the English. Let's look at the English. This is exactly what we're going to read on Shabbos. Some people say it every day after the morning prayers, so we remember not just once a year, but every single day. This is Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17, 18, and 19. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you departed from Egypt, how he encountered you on the way and cut down the weaklings trailing behind you. While you were faint and exhausted, he did not fear God. It shall be that when God your God lets you rest from all your surrounding enemies in the land that God your God gives you as a heritage to bequeath, you are to erase the memory of Amalek from beneath the heaven. Do not forget. Amalek, as we said, attacked the stragglers of the procession out of Egypt with no shame, no embarrassment about doing that. The Amalekites showed us no mercy, showed us no compassion. We eventually answered with humanitarianism. King Shaul, King Saul, in the Haftarah that we're going to read on Shabbos, spared the life of Agag, who was a descendant of Amalek, which cost us down the road because he was also the ancestor of Haman, the bad guy in Megillas Esther. The point is, we never wrote off the Jews who were attacked, even though they were the rear guard of the procession. We never said, oh well, it's on them for not keeping up. Too bad, should have called an Uber. We don't forget. We don't take it lightly, and we don't forget the loss of any of our people, any of them. They're all precious, even the Nachschleppers, especially the Nachschleppers. So in reaction to this preying on the most vulnerable of the Jewish people, we've enshrined it in memory. We say it. We read it out of a Torah, a Sefer Torah, at least once a year. Some of us say it every day from the Siddur. Don't forget the enemy who attacked the Nachschleppers. We drew closer to their memory, closer to each other, and closer to God. And as a result of this, we never forget. We remain on guard, especially for the most vulnerable among us. And then there's the Megillah. On Monday night, and again on Tuesday morning, we're going to read Megillas Esther, the book of Esther, here in Shul. Purim 2020 was our last gathering in Shul before lockdown, before COVID, so we really missed only 1 year, really. And last year we were able to come back to Shul. This year we're back b'toikef, with strength. Wear your costumes, bring your friends and family, and we'll have a great holiday. Megillas Esther is a beautiful story, a simple one on first glance. You got your good guys, you got your bad guys, got your beautiful heroines, princess, queen who saves the day, much adventure, and even some slapstick comedy. Some of us studied in the Meaning in the Megillas series with Rabbi Gottlieb. Stay tuned for more of that, coming up with Ruth before Shavuos, Eicha before Tisha B'Av. Some of us studied an essay this week that was actually a lecture given about 30 years ago by Elie Wiesel. Highly recommend. Now, fascinating really, not just what's in the Megillah, but what's not in the Megillah. What is in there? So much intrigue, almost a comedy of errors. What seems to be a sequence of coincidences that lead to the deliverance of the Jews from genocide and the ultimate punishment of those who sought our destruction. As a fascinating little side note, if you like, you could take a very close look at the Megillah, like very close. And you'll notice that in chapter 9, the verses that mention Haman's 10 sons who were hanged all on one day, if you look closely, you'll see 3 Hebrew letters. They're written in small form, so they stand out from the others. Those letters are Taf, Shin, Zayin, which is the way you write in Hebrew the year 1947. Those who remember the year 1947, or if you're students of history, you'll recall that there were actually 10 men executed by hanging at Nuremberg in one day. Actually, 12 were sentenced to death. 1 was in absentia. 1 took his life by poison the night before. So 10 men who sought the destruction of the Jewish people were hanged on that one day. In 1947, Taf, Shin, Zayin. But that's not the main point. There's a lot in Megillas Esther, much deeper than this. And there's something that is not there, or at least not visible. Esther is the one book, unique among all 24 scriptural books, the whole of Tanakh, which does not have God's name in it. Hashem's name does not appear. There are many theories as to why this is. Perhaps it's the hiddenness that we have to see all these seeming coincidences. This happened, that happened, another thing. We have to read it in order, not allowed to read the Megillah backwards. Doesn't count if you read it out of order, backwards, read a chapter here, a chapter there. You have to read it all the way through to see the sequence of events unfolding and to understand that the hidden hand, the hand of God here is hidden, moving things behind the scenes in a way that we have to be sensitive to notice. Professor Wiesel has his own theory that we studied, that's because of the bloody acts of vengeance that the Jews took on their persecutors once the tables turned at the end of the story. He's not too happy about that, and he thinks God is not too happy about that either. So he writes at the conclusion of the chapter of Sages and Dreamers, which we're studying together on Tuesdays, that God himself took his own name out of the book of Esther because he did not want to be associated with our acts of vengeance on those around us. He says, and it should cause us to reflect, quote, to be Jewish is to have earned the right to punish our enemies, who inevitably turn out to be the enemies of humankind, and to choose not to. End of quote. Still, a main take-home point of Megillas Esther is that the Jews banded together, supported Esther, supported one another, and called out to God for help. When faced with adversity, even planned slaughter, we kept together. We drew each other close, we drew close to Hashem, and we prevailed. And as a result, who knows, maybe even in the merit of that drawing close to each other, we survived and continue to tell the story. Maybe, just maybe, that attitude of pulling together, drawing on our commonality rather than our divisions, is a good strategy for now as it was then. For some time it's felt a little bit like the golden age of North American Jewry isn't what it used to be. Maybe even starting to move toward its close. If that's so, and hopefully it is not, but if it's so, we'll need each other more and more in the years to come, not less. So on this Shabbos of remembrance, let's remember not only what others did to us or tried to do to us, to our harm. Let's also remember the strength we have in our people, our Torah, and our God, which the Zohar tells us is really one. Shabbat Shalom.